So if you're a Line 6 Helix Native plugin user, there may have come a time where you wondered if it's possible to control it via MIDI. Well, that possibility became a reality a couple updates ago with, I believe it was version 1.6, but I see a lot of folks that still find it a little bit confusing to know exactly how to do that. So in this video, I wanted to take you through the steps and get you to understand a little bit about how you could control Helix Native using a MIDI controller. And this could be a very useful feature for a lot of different situations. So without further ado, let's get into it. So here I am in Cubase 11 Pro. This is my DAW of choice. Now, one word about this video, it's going to be impossible for me to run through every DAW that's out there. Some folks are using Reaper, some are using Cubase, some are using Ableton, some are using Pro Tools. I'm not overly familiar with every DAW out there, but they all have somewhat of a similar set of features and will probably have a similar way to set up what I'm going to show you. But for today's video, I'm going to show you in Cubase. So first of all, my setup. I am using IK Multimedia Axe.io USB audio interface, and it has MIDI ins and outs on it. So you're going to need a way to get your MIDI in and out of your computer or your DAW. Now, I'm also using today a Morningstar MC6 Mark II MIDI controller pedal. These guys are one of my favorite companies. Go give them a look if you are in the market for a great MIDI foot switch. These are programmable to a ridiculous degree and very easy to use and very customizable. So what I opted to do, Morningstar does work with USB over MIDI. I was finding it a little tricky to get set up. It wasn't really reacting. That could just be something in my system, though. It should work fine if you hook it in through USB. But for this video, I've hooked in the MIDI out with the MIDI cable to the MIDI input on the Axe.io. So the first thing we have to make sure of is that we are getting MIDI information into our DAW. But first things first, I want to do this. I'm going to take this a step-by-step approach. We're going to go and look at the Helix Native pilot guide to understand what we can do as far as MIDI goes. And then we will program the MC6 to do what we want it to do. And then from there, I will show you how to get it talking to Helix Native within your DAW, because we know we have to have a host to run Helix Native. So first things first, let's pull up the Line 6 Helix Native Pilots Guide. And what I've done is I've jumped down to this end section here on page 60 where it tells us what MIDI CC numbers work for what. So, for instance, MIDI CC, or control change number 69, is used to control snapshots. So if we use the CC number 69 and then a value from 0 to 7, if it's in Helix mode, we can switch between snapshot 1 to 8. Obviously, if it's in HX effects compatibility mode, we'll only get 4 snapshots, and HX stomp will only get 3. But we'll just leave it as if it was the Helix for now. So 0 value would recall snapshot 1, number 1 would recall snapshot 2, and so on and so forth down the line. Now, the other thing we can do is we can use it to bypass and engage effects blocks, which is going to probably be the two main uses we're going to have inside of a preset. We're going to want to maybe bypass a block, turn a distortion pedal on, turn a distortion pedal off, or pick a snapshot. So we'll go through those features today. So we see here, we're going to have MIDI CC number 69 with the values from 0 to 7. That's going to be important to remember. So what I can do then is I can pull up my Morningstar MIDI editor, and I've already got my MC6 Mark II hooked into this. I have lots of videos using the Morningstar MIDI controllers if you want to learn a little more. I'm not going to make this video super long showing you how to use that. I have other videos up for that. But for now, let's say that we wanted to have the ability to control Helix Native to switch through, let's say, 4 snapshots and turn a couple of effects blocks on and off. Let's start there and see if we can get it to do that. So I'm going to start by pressing my A switch, and you'll notice over here, as I switch through, up here the preset changes. So I have 6 presets in bank 1 here on the first page. So I'm going to just go to button number 1. I'm going to say snap 1, because I'm going to get this to change to snapshot number 1. I'm going to go down to my message button, and I'm going to say when I press that, I want it to send a control change. And we already said that the CC number for that was going to be CC number 69. And I wanted to have a value of 0 simply because I want that to choose snapshot number 1 as I have up here. Now, very important, we have to save the preset before we go flipping through here. So I'm going to copy this preset, and I'm going to switch now by pressing preset B. I'm going to paste that same thing here, but I'm going to alter this to snapshot 2, and I'm going to change the CC value to 1. So now that should access snapshot number 2. You'll notice the MIDI channel I'm keeping as number 1, just so I remember it so I can assign that within our DAW later on. Okay, I'm still got that copied. I'm going to go over to preset C. I'm going to paste that as well. We'll call this snapshot 3, and I'm going to change this value to number 2, which should, if we're doing everything right, access snapshot number 3. And then we'll do one more. Select button D or preset D. We'll paste this yet again. And I am going to go for snapshot 4 here, which would be CC value 3, and I'm going to save that. Now let's also do this. Let's go over to another button. You'll see on the screen on my MC6 all of those names: snap 1, snap 2, snap 3. Actually, I need to change this one too to snap 4 so that it's accurately represented. Now I'm going to go to preset E, or my next button. I'm going to say, what if I want the ability to turn some effects on and off? Well, I'm going to sit here and say, let's say it was a distortion. And I'll just go distortion, or distort however many characters I can get in there. What I'm going to do is I am going to use toggle mode here, and I am going to say when I press, I want a control change on CC number, and I'm just going to pick number 4. I know that one's available. So I'm going to set this value to 0, but I'm also going to say that this is going to be in position 1, and then I'm going to do another message that's going to be a control change. This is going to be position 2, and I'm going to set that same CC number to 4, and I'm going to change this value all the way up to 127. Now you might ask why I'm doing that. I'm also keeping these all on MIDI channel 1. What I've done here is I've set up an ability for on control change number 4, when I press the button once, it's going to send the CC value 0. When I press the button again, it's going to send a different control change value of 127. That's going to act for turning on and off the bypass state of an effect. So we're going to put that on a distortion pedal. So now that I've got this set up, we can go see if this will actually work within our DAW. So here we are in Cubase. Now, we first of all want to make sure that everything is talking to the DAW properly. If we don't have MIDI signal coming into the DAW, then Helix Native is not going to see anything and will not be able to be controlled. So right down here, if you notice, if I hover over these little meters here, it says MIDI in activity and MIDI out activity. Now, if I press one of the buttons that I just made, the distort button, you'll see some activity flashing here. And that's showing me that Cubase is actually receiving MIDI activity from my MC6 going into my Axe.io, and the MIDI is entering Cubase. So that's a good sign. You know, we can also go up to our studio setup here, and there's a MIDI port setup right here, and we will see if our MIDI devices are there. Now I have a lot hooked up to this computer that I use. There you'll see the Morningstar itself would be MIDI over USB, but we're using the Axe.io input. So it is there. It seems to be working. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add an audio track, and I'm going to name this Native. And I am going to come over here and bring in an instance of Helix Native as a VST3 plugin. So here we have it. It's popped up on the screen. I have a blank preset within Helix Native. Now, the other thing I am going to do, though, is add a MIDI track to Cubase. And I can name this whatever I want. I could call it Helix Native MIDI. Now, what I'm going to do over here, if you notice in our inspector, is it gives me both input and output settings. So what I need is for this track here to accept the MIDI that's being sent from my Morningstar pedal. So I want that to come in, since the Morningstar pedal is hooked into the Axe.io interface. The input routing for MIDI will be coming in via the Axe.io. So that's already set correctly. You'll notice I have different choices here. So we're going to leave that there. Now I want that output to go through that track and be sent over to Helix Native. So if you notice on the MIDI output routing, if I pull that down, way down here it says Native, insert one Helix Native MIDI in. So if I select that now, what I've done is I am now sending MIDI through this track from our Morningstar MC6 Mark II into the IK Multimedia Axe.io audio interface, or in this case, MIDI interface. It's going through this track and it's being routed now to the track I set up with Helix Native. I've found this is probably the easiest way to get Cubase working with MIDI for Helix Native. So what we want to do now is we want to see if this is at all working. So if I come up here, we've programmed button A, B, C, and D to access snapshots. So if I press button B, we would hope that this is going to switch over to snapshots, but it's not. Now what happens if I record enable this track? Now we see that that works. So if I don't record enable my MIDI track, it is not getting any MIDI sent through it. I believe I can also do it with just the monitor button as well. So either or both. Something so that that track is recognizing the actual input and sending it back out through its output. So I can just leave it as such. So now we see with what we've already done, I can switch through snapshots. And if you don't know where I'm looking right now, look up at our snapshot button here. I hit the button A or preset A, I get snapshot 1. Preset B, snapshot 2, preset C, snapshot 3, and snapshot 4. Now let's add a few blocks to this. Let's just put in an amp and a cab. Really doesn't matter what it is. And we'll put in a distortion block as well. Now we said that we put button E or preset E on the Morningstar set to turn one of these effects on and off. And I used CC number 4. So there's two ways we can do this. We can right click this and there is MIDI bypass here. I could go up here and I could hit CC number 4 because I remembered that that's what I programmed this to do. Now, if everything was programmed correctly, when I hit this button, it should turn on and off the state of the distortion pedal I just put in, and it's doing just that. Pretty impressive stuff. The other way I could do that also, if I went and erased that, now it's not working, is I could also just come here and hit the MIDI learn. Now you'll notice there's a little brain head and a brain flashing here. When I hit that button now, it will recognize that I want it to be on CC number 4. That's probably the easiest way to do it since you don't have to then remember which you programmed for each one. Now let's take this a step further. What if we wanted to control parameters within Helix Native? Let's say that I wanted one of the foot switches to control 2 different gain settings on my distortion pedal. Or maybe I wanted to control different drive settings on my amp. Let's do that one. So what I can do is I can come to my drive one. Let's say that's the parameter that we want. Now what I've done is I don't have this button controlling the distortion pedal anymore. So we have that CC number 4 freed up. It's still programmed on my MC6. So if I right click this parameter, you'll notice it'll say controller assign, and I can go down to MIDI CC, and if I assign that to MIDI CC number 4, or again, I could come down here and say MIDI learn for that. When I hit that button, it now knows it's assigned to number 4. So I could do that manually, or I can do it with MIDI learn. MIDI learn is probably the easiest way to do it. So now what's going to happen when I press that is it's going to bounce between 0 and 10. You wonder what just happened to the 2.8 setting that was there. Well, if we go over to the automation controller assign page, we'll see all our assignments. And you'll notice here we have the Voltage Queen Drive 1 MIDI CC4. If we click that, it gives me an ability to not only change the MIDI CC number if I want, but we're going to leave it. It's working for us. I could say, let's say I want the minimum drive setting at 2.8, which is where it was set, and I want the maximum drive setting at 5.3. Now when I go back here and press this button, it's going to simply bounce back and forth between those two settings that I set in my automation controller assign page. All right, what do you guys think? I hope I was clear on that, and I hope I went through all the steps properly so that that can help you to understand it. We're basically looking for a signal flow, right? We have to have a MIDI input from some MIDI controller. Obviously, in a video like this, I don't have the resources or the time to go through every DAW, every MIDI controller, every audio interface, but we need a way to get the MIDI into the computer, obviously. We need a host for Helix Native that's going to accept that MIDI. And once we look through the documentation of every, whether it's our MIDI controller or our DAW or our host, and we figure out how to get the MIDI into that, then once we know that signal is flowing into it, we have to have a way to get that MIDI onto the track that Native is on. And then we can use the assignments within Native, much like we can within HX Stomp and Helix. And it's a very wonderful system to have and gives us a lot of the functionality of a full-blown Helix within our DAW if we have a means of controlling it. So I hope I didn't miss anything. I hope I didn't confuse anybody with that, and I hope I covered everything. And I also hope that really helps a few folks to maybe be able to set Helix Native up to be able to be used with the MIDI controller and get more use out of it. Thanks so much for tuning in, guys. Please like the video, share it with anybody who you think would get some use out of watching it. That's always much appreciated. Please subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell notification to get notified when I put new content out. And I will be back really soon with some more. Thank you guys again so much for tuning in. Ciao for now.